Good morning, everyone, or well, maybe good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's session of our theme week on degrowth, South and North, with a lecture by Ashish Kothari and Shrishtee Bajpai. This event is hosted by the Humanities Center for Advanced Studies Futures of Sustainability, Modernization, Transformation, Control at the University of Hamburg in Germany. My name is Philipp Degens, and I'm a research associate at the center. Together with my colleagues Frank Adloff and Sarah Lenz, I'm organizing this theme week on degrowth. So it is my pleasure to welcome Ashish Kothari, Shrishtee Bajpai, and Christine Löw, who will be presenting today. We are glad to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us today. But before we begin, I'll have a technical note. We are in a Zoom webinar right now, and we are recording the talk and also the comment. Afterwards, we will stop recording and give all of you the opportunity to join the discussion and switch on your cameras so you can raise your questions yourselves. For those of you who have not been able to attend last week's sessions, I will very, very briefly introduce you to the idea of the theme week and also our center in general. I will then introduce the speakers to you before they give the talk. The center is funded by the German Research Foundation, and it began its work in 2019. It is directed by Frank Adloff and Sigurd Neckel and deals with the overall question of how societies change when they are guided by different notions of sustainability. The initial observation is that sustainability has become something of a guiding principle for states, organizations, companies, and social movements alike. Just think of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals or the Global Fridays for Future movement that both illustrate the role of sustainability as a general ideal for social change. Yet there is no consensus over the goals and visions of the future associated with this concept. Instead, notions of sustainability conceal very different processes, values, and ideas about the future. At the center, we analytically distinguish between three trajectories of sustainability that sometimes contradict each other, or maybe even regularly. They are modernization, transformation, and control. Ecological modernization, for example, refers to ideas of a green economy and green growth, implying only quite moderate adjustments within the current institutional framework. Whereas critics of this approach, such as degrowth thinkers and practitioners, by contrast see the imperative of economic growth as an obstacle for sustainable development. They instead support a fundamental transformation of society. Politics of control, to also mention the third trajectory identified at our center, rather refers to an ecological state of emergency and to enforcing resilience measures for vulnerable populations while creating safe enclaves for only privileged few. It is these three possible trajectories of social change, modernization, transformation, and control, that we attempt to analyze at the center. They represent different and highly contested imaginaries of the future and are linked to distinctive practices which in turn are interdependent with specific social structures, material infrastructures, or the ecological system of the earth. Today, and in fact during this theme week, of course we focus on the trajectory of transformation and in particular on notions of degrowth and related imaginaries of transformational change. Degrowth does not solely demand economic change, but goes further and offers a vision of a different society that is to be based on radically different economic, social, cultural, and political conditions. How to get there, what challenges and hindrances do exist, what new cleavages or crises might occur, are questions that ought to be discussed in this series of events. So we'd like to explore opportunities and approaches for a planned, democratic, and peaceful transition to an economy without growth dependency, but also to critically reflect on limits and problems of such approaches. In particular, we'd like to scrutinize the concept of degrowth with regard to three dimensions. First, we raise the question whether degrowth entails a Eurocentric bias, ignoring material and social realities of the global South. Secondly, we focus on the gendered role of work by questioning the old, yet still very influential contrast between male productive employment on the one hand and female unproductive care work on the other. Thirdly, we ask to what extent the Western subject-object dualism has to be put into question and what perspectives might contribute to a different understanding of nature. Last week, we began our theme week with talks by Vandana Shiva and Jason Hickel, and they already raised many of these issues, highlighting, for example, the need to decolonize or new relations with nature, and also the role of gendered work. And we are looking forward to continuing these discussions today and tomorrow. Tomorrow, in fact, we'll have a talk by Ariel Saleh on ecofeminism, care and labor. And today, Ashish Kothari and Shrishtee Bajpai present on Eco-swaraj. So please let me introduce these two speakers. Both are members of the environmental nonprofit organization Kalpavrij, that is based in Pune in Maharashtra, India, and both do combine activism and research in their work. So we are very glad to have you here. Ashish Kothari not only co-founded Kalpavrij, but has been active with various people's movements and government committees, including the Committee on Implementation of the Forest Rights Act or the Biological Diversity Act Committee, and several more. Besides, he has served on Greenpeace International's and Greenpeace India's boards, and also he has taught at the Indian Institute of Public Administration. Since the 1990s, he has published on biodiversity and on community participation and conservation, and on development, particularly but not only, the Indian development strategy, as well as on radical ecological democracy. He contributed severely to the post-development discourse, and in total, he authored or co-authored over 30 books and numerous articles. I will only be able to highlight very few. For one, he published in 2019 Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, together with Ariel Saleh, Arturo Escobar, Alberto Acosta, and Federico Di Maria, who commented Jason Hickel's talk last week, by the way. With the latter two, he has also written When Vivir, Degrowth and Ecological Swaraj, Alternatives to Sustainable Development in the Green Economy, in the journal Development in 2014. And he's also, together with Asim Srivastava, co-author of the book Churning the Earth, The Making of Global India, that was published in 2012. Over the last years, he increasingly has collaborated with Shrishtee Bajpai, who is also a member at Kalpavrij. Shrishtee, we are glad to have you here as well, of course. Shrishtee holds a master's in development studies and is one of the coordinators of Wilkab Sangam, or the Confluence of Alternatives. This confluence is searching for, and I quote, alternative ways of meeting human needs and aspirations without trashing the earth and without leaving half of humanity behind. End of quote. The confluence aims at bringing together practitioners, researchers, thinkers, and others who work on prefiguring alternatives to the dominant forms of economic development and political governance. Shrishtee is also a core team member of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, and she's also working for the recognition of rights of rivers in India and beyond. For example, she is a member of the Executive Committee of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. Shrishtee is currently a fellow at the Post-Growth Institute in the US, and at the moment, her research centers on exploring alternative development models, ecological and social justice movements, and rights of nature. She focuses on exploring indigenous, traditional, and customary ways of living, decision-making, and their underlying worldviews. Partly together with Ashish and others, she has published, for example, We Are the Rivers and the River Is Us, an economic and political weekly, but also in The Guardian and other journals and newspapers. So we could not have speakers as guests that fit better to our theme work. So we're really glad to have you here. And the talk that Ashish and Shrishtee will give today is titled Eco-swaraj, Radical Ecological Democracy Towards Justice and Sustainability. Ashish and Shrishtee, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Thanks. So we're going to get straight into it because it'll be nice for us to finish in about 45 minutes and then have a longish time for discussion. And of course, also to hear Christine's comments on our presentation. So we look forward to that. I'm going to share screen. So let me know if this is working. This is okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Okay, so as Philippe said, the title of our presentation is Eco-swaraj, Radical Ecological Democracy. We will come back into explaining these terms, exactly what we mean. But before we do that, there are two sections we want to do. One is very, very brief, which is just a sort of a recap of the current crises that we are all in, wherever we are on Earth. We won't do that in detail because that's the sort of thing that all of you are probably very familiar with. The second part is going to look at radical alternative, on-ground radical alternative initiatives from different parts of the world, which are trying to find answers to the kind of crises we're in. And then the third part gets into looking at eco-swaraj and other alternative worldviews which emerge from these grounded initiatives. As I've requested Philippe and others, sometimes we in India, because of our British colonial heritage, speak too fast in English. So please do slow us down if we are running like a railway train. Right. So in terms of the crises that we're in, if you look around any of the kind of crises, whether it's ecological or social, the crisis of inequality, the crises of alienation, etc., one of the common factors of that is the model of development that has been brought all over India, all over the world, imposed in countries like India and elsewhere, in a form that what many of us see is a form of violence. It's a kind of violence against the rest of nature, as you see in this particular advertisement from an Indian multinational corporation. It's a form of violence against communities, especially communities most heavily dependent on, for whose livelihoods nature and natural resources and land is so very crucial. And individuals also, all of us in one way or the other are impacted by this model of development in its race towards material possessions, modernization, etc. In many different ways. I call this a movement from livelihoods, which were not just jobs, but were occupations that were connected with culture and ecological roots, to mass-produced jobs and the destruction of those livelihoods, which I would call deadlihoods. So we also see that this model of development is causing greater and greater inequality. Jason probably spoke about this yesterday. This is, we are currently, in fact, living in possibly the history's most unequal period. And you can see that in terms of the distribution of wealth, the distribution of resources, the distribution of access to aspects of living, which are so crucial for all of us. We've also seen that in many parts of the world, this model of development and everything that underlies it does not brook dissent and protest. And it tends to increasingly bear down on people who are trying to raise their voices against the kind of destruction that is caused by development. And the NGO Global Witness, for instance, has documented more than 4 people being killed every week, just defending their territories or their lands and their forests from the kind of so-called development that is taking place. In India, we've also seen where people raise their voices, are increasingly being called not just anti-development, but also anti-national and sometimes secessionist and terrorist. And then in the COVID pandemic period, we've also seen how governments in many parts of the world have used this as an opportunity to increase state surveillance over citizens, to become more authoritarian, and private corporations have used it as an opportunity to become even more profit-seeking, as you see in the figure up there on the top right-hand side. But on the other hand, and that's what we want to really focus on the substantial part of this presentation, is that there is the other side of humanity, which is where people have also, during the COVID pandemic, gone out of their comfort zones to help other people, to express solidarity, to form collectives of mutual support, young people helping the elderly, and many other such ways in which what should I say, the sort of better side of human nature has also come out in this time of crisis. We'll give a few examples of these as we go along in the presentation. Now, when we critique development and everything that underlies it, obviously the question that comes back to us is, well, okay, there's some ecological destruction, some people are getting left behind, but we have no alternative, right? That's the the Margaret Thatcher dictum, there is no alternative, the Tina factor as they called it. And so the question arises, are there alternatives? Are there other ways by which to meet human needs and aspirations without, as you read in Shrishtee's bio, without trashing the earth and without leaving half of humanity behind? And according to us, there are alternatives. But what is important for us is to ask the question, alternatives to what? Because one of the things that the system is telling us is, yeah, okay, if we're producing waste somewhere, let's just recycle it. Yes, okay, if we're emitting carbon somewhere, let's make sure we capture it somewhere else. And what that does is it doesn't really address the underlying structures and relations which are causing the problems in the first place. It basically treats the symptoms. And according to us, those underlying structures are in a way related to the concentration of power, the power to take decisions in the hands of corporations, private corporations, when it's a capitalist world, in the hands of nation states, when it's state domination, including in so-called state socialist societies, in the hands of men over women, or some sexualities and genders over others, in the hands of some castes, some races, ethnicities, etc. So you find different forms of inequality in the power to take decisions in different societies and through history, which are in some senses underlying this inequalities and the oppression and the unsustainability that we talked about. And then also related to all of these is the inequality or the concentration of power in the hands of human beings vis-a-vis other species and the rest of the earth. And so if we're looking at solutions, we have to be very careful to go beyond the kind of solutions that the same system is giving us. The same structures of oppression and unsustainability are telling us, okay, what are the solutions? The solutions are make sure that there's good pricing, different kinds of pricing mechanisms, make sure there's enough technologies. We will make sure that all the carbon that's being emitted will be captured somewhere else using fancy technologies and planting trees all over the world. And even sustainable development in the way that it's come to us in the last 3 decades is in some senses a superficial solution because it doesn't really tackle those fundamental structures. And so what really are genuine alternatives? What we think is that there are 2 kinds. One is where people are saying no to the system. They're saying enough is enough. We are going to challenge the fundamental structures and relations of oppression and unsustainability of whatever kind we are facing. And in doing that, we are also going to express our own worldviews and our own notions of how to relate to the rest of nature and to each other. This image is from 30 years back. It's a protest by indigenous peoples in central India against 2 mega dams, hydroelectricity projects that were proposed to be built on this river. And what these people were saying was not just that we are against the displacement of our villages and the dispossession of our land and the destruction of our livelihoods and forests, but also that this river, which according to you is meant for hydroelectricity in megawatts, for us is our mother. And in that sense, they were expressing a very different way of being, of knowing, of relating to the rest of nature. And that's the kind of expression that we're seeing in resistance movements in so many different parts of the world. We've just had one of the most incredible post-independence movements in India of the farmers over 1 year, probably Vandana spoke about that. We are having the anti-racism movements in so many parts of the world. We have the peace movements in Myanmar, Burma, and elsewhere. We have the movements for constitutional reform and some incredible things that are happening in Chile. We have the climate justice movements, the youth movements for climate justice, and so on. And many, many others, which are kind of, in that sense, what Gandhiji called satyagraha, that is speaking truth to power. And through that, and in mostly non-violent ways, trying to also change the direction of this society. But along with that, the second kind of alternative is that of constructive alternatives, of reconstructing or constructing worlds in which different kinds of basic needs and aspirations of people are met in ways that are ecologically sustainable and which are also equitable and just. In India, we've been documenting many of these. We have a website which we'll show you at the end, which has about 1,600, 1,700 stories of this kind of solutions that people themselves are finding. But this is happening all over the world. We have, you also already mentioned the book Pluriverse, which has about 90 examples of these from different parts of the world. Possibly Federico yesterday may have mentioned it. But we are actually seeing this kind of responses, some very old responses that are coming back in recent times from indigenous peoples and others, some very new ones arising from within the industrial system, which are both challenging the current system, but also providing constructive alternatives. And what we're going to do in the next 15, 20 minutes is to go through about 10, 15 examples from different parts of the world, just to illustrate the kinds of things that are happening. So at this stage, I'm going to turn it over to Shrishtee to start with the examples.
Thanks, Ashish, and namaste to everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So the very first example we bring you from central India. It's a Gond Adivasi community, Gond indigenous peoples. And what they have been doing is that they've been protesting against a mining project since last 2 decades in their traditional territories. And while the resistance was on, they realized that it is important for them to collectivize, take control over their local means of production, and hence formed a federation of 90 villages that came together and formed what they call as a Mahagram Sabha. First, to ensure that they have control over the local livelihoods, but along with that also experimenting on various governance models and direct democracy models, which has been a mix of both modern and traditional decision-making systems. And with that, very strongly asserting their own cultural identity of what it is to be an indigenous person, what are their cultures, what are their traditions, and finding a renewed sense of respect and hope for that. And along with that, also questioning their own systems of traditions that have been possibly oppressive against women or other caste, and trying to change and alter that as well, while their own processes of local transformations are underway. The other example, which is not too far from this region in Kochi, is the Menda Lekha, where 30 years ago, this village declared that we elect government in Mumbai and Delhi, but in our village, we are the government. And it's an amazing process, because what they did in Menda Lekha 30-35 years ago actually had a spiral effect in various Adivasi communities and indigenous communities in this entire region. And Kochi is one such example that got inspired by Menda Lekha. And what Menda did was very inspiring, of how they localized their control in decision making, and how everybody in the village had the opportunity to participate in it. One of the very important parts of their local transformation, of how they actually gave up all their private land. Every individual household gave up their private land, and all the land in Menda is actually in commons. Ashish, next. The other example comes from the southern central part of India, Deccan Development Society. Again, a very, very inspiring example, which is primarily led by Dalit women farmers. Dalit is a particular caste in India, which is so-called untouchables and very marginalized. And these women farmers, who are small-scale farmers, led this movement, formed their collective to not just secure their land rights and take control over their food security systems by reviving their traditional agricultural diversity, but along with that also ensuring that they are food sovereign, and with that creating various ways of involving women in other creative forms of engagement, like women becoming filmmakers, documenting their own traditional knowledge. They're running cafes, they also organizing various cultural programs, schooling for children. And while the pandemic was on, these women were not just able to feed themselves, but also to hundreds of migrants who were traveling back from the cities to the villages, and provide them with very nutritious food. Next, Ashish. And while many of these examples that we shared has been very inspiring for all of us who have been engaged with these examples or have heard or known about them, we felt that it is important to bring out how many of these processes responded during the COVID times, where everything was around us was pretty hopeless and gloomy. But there were also several of these stories where people were able to respond to the crisis through solidarity, through resilience, because they had their existing local processes of transformations underway. So a lot of these stories that we have documented bring out how people, because of their existing processes, were able to respond to the crisis much better and were able to stand in solidarity with each other. There are some other examples from other parts of the world that possibly, Ashish, you can take over now.
Sure, thanks, Shrishtee. So yeah, going over to the completely the other side of the world, this is from Peru, from the Andes highlands of Peru, where the Quechua indigenous community has a similar story to the Dalit women farmers that Shrishtee just told us, where they have for the last several decades taken complete control over what they call their biocultural territory. And they conserve and use a huge diversity of potato. This is the area where, one of the areas where potato originated. So they've asserted their self-determination, self-governance, forms of direct democracy in every community, etc. And during the pandemic, they were food secure, but also were able to provide food to those in Cusco town, including orphanages and so on, that didn't actually have enough food and couldn't access it because of the economic lockdown. A little bit further south, this is in the Ecuadorian Amazon, the Sapara indigenous nation. I was lucky to be there in 2019. And they have a very interesting hybrid economy. They try and assert their own traditional way of life, which is living in harmony with the forest and the river, not just in terms of material relationships, but also spiritual relationships, where they believe every plant, every animal, every stone, every part of the river has a spirit, and that they need to respect it. They also live by interpreting their dreams every day. So there is that whole traditional way of doing it, asserting their language, etc., but also knowing that they have to relate to the outside world. They have initiated a community health-based ecotourism project, where people from outside come and actually are able to learn their healing practices and their ways of looking at themselves and the rest of nature and healing themselves through that. So in some senses, trying to kind of both retain their own ways of life, but also relate to the outside world. And in fact, you see what we call territories of life, where communities, indigenous peoples and other communities all over the world, thousands of examples, are trying to sustain their traditional conservation of and sustainable use of natural ecosystems and wildlife populations, or create new ways of doing it where those old ways are no longer available. These territories of life range from very small, a few hectares, to hundreds of thousands of square kilometers in different parts of the world. If you look at that website at the bottom, you'll find, I'll put it again in the chat at the end, you'll find hundreds of examples of case studies of these. And so, in fact, taking some of these examples into mind, we also recently brought out the first volume of COVID resilience stories from different parts of the world. Shrishtee, in fact, coordinated that. So, Steve, you want to take over?
Yeah, so this is the first volume of collection of various narratives, as Ashish was mentioning, from around the world, which is based on collaborative writing. And they together provide us with various expressions of resistance to dominant forms of oppressions, to defend local ways of life, strengthen local autonomy, and how are people reconstructing societies. And they show how COVID-19 and the problems it has highlighted in the society have solutions already demonstrated by communities and initiatives and civil society that have very important lessons to us, for us, and pathways for a just, equitable, and ecologically resilient futures. So we will put a link of this particular one also for you to look over. There's another very inspiring example that we wish to share and speak about, which possibly a lot of you would also be aware of, is the Kurdish Rojava women's movement from Central Asia. Why this example is so inspiring is because of the kind of processes that they're undertaking in the most war-torn region of the world, primarily relying on the eco-feminist principles, what they call as genealogy, and grounding it in those principles. and talking about autonomy, direct democracy, and democratic confederalism, I would like to share the quote, which I think captures a lot of what this movement is trying to do, by one of their activists. This is Besime Concha, who is currently in Germany, actually, in exile. And she spoke to us and told of why the Kurdish women's movement and liberation movement is so important, because the capitalist modernity is trying to tell us that there's no the way of living, while many of these examples that we have been speaking about and the Kurdish movement is showing that there are so many ways of actually people coming together to living and to being in this world. Yeah, next slide, please. Ashish, over to you.
Okay, yeah, so, and from Europe itself, many of you would be familiar with the phenomenon of the social and solidarity economy, or non-capitalist ways of trying to organize the economy. Just a few examples of this, which I've been privileged to have seen. Alternative currencies in many parts of Europe. This is from Luxembourg, where 5 communities run this currency called the Beki. So a lot of the local exchange happens using that, which is makes them a little bit at least independent of the euro. This school in Athens in Greece is run with very high quality teaching and management, but with very low fees, and which enables a lot of the poorer families in the neighborhood to be able to send their kids here, because a lot of the people in the community share their time and resources free of cost, some teaching, some management, etc., as part of a larger system of what they call time banking, or sharing time without charging for it. Whatever one's expertise, you can give a few hours of free service to the neighborhood, to the community. Non-profit cafes, social solidarity cafes, where, for instance, mostly refugees or people with disabilities are the ones who are employed. A lot of young people saying that, yes, of course, we want to do business, we want to earn our income back, but we don't want to make profits out of it. And we would much rather that the business becomes socially relevant rather than us becoming richer and richer and richer. And you actually see examples of other kinds of examples of this, such as open software, alternative medias, and many others. This was a factory is a factory in Greece, which is run democratically by all the workers. It's an olive oil based cleaning agents factory. And here the workers have set up a cooperative, and there is no boss, there's nobody in charge, everybody takes decisions, and quite remarkably, everyone is paid exactly the same wage, regardless of what kind of work is being done, for 1 hour of work. Let's move over to now some other urban areas, urban examples also. I think this is from Western India, and back to you, Shrishtee.
Yeah, thanks, Ashish. So very often when we share many of these examples, the first question that is asked to us is that, well, this is possible in local villages or rural areas, but possibly not the cities. And so there are several examples where people have experimented on. And one such example is from Western India, where this process kind of got triggered with a massive earthquake that happened in the city of Bhuj in 2000, which led many civil society groups and people to come together, realizing that they can't always go to the government to change things, but also there's a lot to be done at the civil society level as well. And what they've started as a process called the Homes in the City program, which is aiming at creating a direct democracy process wherein the city is imagined from the perspective and people's imagination who are usually in the margins. City planning doesn't include people like city vendors, street vendors, doesn't include people like city pastoralists, doesn't include women. And how do we bring these marginalized voices into the city planning to create self-reliance in, say, water, to create solid waste management processes, recommoning of spaces, and ensuring dignified housing for the poor. The other example that we bring you from is actually from Europe, which is a very inspiring example of an experiment in Denmark, a self-governed community spread over 85 acres near Copenhagen, which is a thriving alternative to a capitalist or a status society, where around 1,000 people living in 16 local communes are self-governing through consensus-based decision-making processes, and actually doing very inspiring stuff through cooperatives, trying to make eco-friendly designing of the houses, and doing most of their stuff in commons. And much of this has happened because young people 40 years ago started this anarchic community in the most capitalized regions of the world. Next one, Ashish.
Yeah, and also just to mention quickly about Christiania, this is also like that village of Mendhalekha. Here also they don't believe in any private property, so everything is part of the commons. You don't even inherit your parents' house. It will go to whoever is next in line and deserving. The last one from cities, I mean, we could go on with many more examples, but this is also quite an interesting phenomenon in some parts of the world where cities are being governed through what's called municipalism or feminist municipalism, or trying to govern through the politics of solidarity and cooperation rather than the politics of competition, and also having one's ears always close to the ground, listening to people's assemblies. What are the demands coming up? What are the issues that the poorest are facing, issues of ecology and so on. Last couple of things we want to talk about with examples, and then we'll get to our framework of Eco-swaraj, is those relating to education and culture and science and technology and knowledge. Because we know that, for instance, where we learn what we are as human beings, what we want to be in future, what is our aspiration, what do we want to aim for, etc., is in our childhood, in our homes, and of course in our schools and other such areas. And unfortunately, at least in India, probably most parts of the world, schools are where, in the last few decades, what we're basically being told is to become more and more selfish, individualistic, aim for becoming famous, aim for becoming rich, aim for becoming powerful, and not really about how does one help everybody in the class to move up collectively. How do we actually become a more responsible human being? We demand our rights, but we also have our responsibilities. And how do we continue relating to the rest of nature on which we are dependent, right? So these things are unfortunately mostly out of the school system. So these are examples from different parts of the world, where they're trying to create a learning environment, not necessarily schools, but a learning environment in which curiosity, talent, which is inherent in every child, the ability to work with others, all of this is what's actually encouraged. And what Gandhi said long back, that education has to be not just about the mind, but about the mind, the heart, and the hands, a combination of all of these in order to create a full and holistic human being. One of our obsessions is to go back into the original meanings of words. And when I started working on this, I realized that the original word for school was schole in Greek, which meant leisure or learning with leisure, which is about the last thing that happens in India schools, at least. An example from Mexico, which Shrishtee had visited.
Yeah, so, well, Universidad de la Tierra from Mexico is University of the Earth, which was founded as a response to the Mexican schooling system, wherein the indigenous peoples felt that it has been an instrument of destruction. And how do we respond to such a destructive, violence-oriented schooling system was to create our own autonomous learning spaces, which are rooted in our connection with the Mother Earth, where people are provided with the space to learn, design what they want to learn, as Ashish was earlier mentioning about these examples. And this particular one that you see on the picture is run by 13 women who have created this learning space for themselves, where they cook, where they grow their toxic-free food, and actually also practice various traditional healing systems of not just psychological, physical, but a very rounded healing systems of well-being.
Okay, and then lastly, we also know that technology, media, communications are captured by either corporations or by the government. And we also have this mindset that technological innovations only happen in those big formal institutions or in corporations. Whereas in fact, we know that for most of human history, technological innovation has happened by so-called ordinary people. And so how do we bring back technology into the commons? How do we re-democratize it? And again, brilliant examples from so many different parts of the world of technologies that are in the commons, that are ecologically sensitive and which are accessible to everybody and not just to the rich. And the same thing with communications. Lots of examples here from India of people trying to create alternative forms of, or alternative platforms in which people's voices can come out, which are normally often hidden or rejected by mainstream media, which is, as I said, controlled by governments and corporations. So all of these, if you look at it, kind of form, they're still marginal. Many of them are imperfect in many different ways. No, there's nothing that's perfect. But in one way or the other, they show the potential of a different way of being able to devise society. And so therefore, the question that arises for all of us is, do we have something that's emerging from these sorts of examples from different parts of the world? Are there holistic frameworks of a society that could be very different from what we have right now? So that's what we get into now, which is the last part of our presentation. So in India, through the Vikalp Sangam process, the alternatives confluence process, which we'll also describe right at the end, we kind of, with the help of and with participation of people from all these different initiatives, sort of sat together and coming up with a framework which we call the Eco-swaraj, and I'll come back to that in a minute, which has 5 different spheres of transformation. So this flower of transformation is about the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, and the ecological transformations. This is one way of looking at it. There are many different ways of looking at it. And of course, all of these are interlinked and enmeshed with each other. We don't have the time to go into each one of these in detail, but just to give a quick glimpse of the kinds of transformations taking place from the examples we've already given you. So for instance, in the political sphere, where people are arguing that democracy is not just about going to elections and voting a party in power, which we hope will do the right thing. And if it doesn't, we elect somebody else next time around. But democracy is really about us taking power wherever we are, because we're born with that power. But that is power not to dominate, but power to do good and with other people, right? So the slogan that Shrishtee mentioned with the village in central India, that in our village, we are the government. You could say that about an urban neighborhood. You can say that about a school, a college, or institution. That everybody who's in that participates and says, we are part of decision making here. And then on the basis of that, you can actually think of what would larger and larger scale of decision making look like. We can come back to that in the discussion. Now, along with that, of course, it's very important that people also have control over the economy, because unless you're able to control your means of production, if that is in the hands of private corporations, then having local political democracy doesn't really make much sense. And so examples that we've given of more self-reliance for basic needs, worker-owned production, the commons rather than privatization, bringing back the economy of caring and sharing, not just the economy of money and finance. And through all of that, then being able to move beyond GDP and economic growth as indicators of well-being, which are really stupid and completely inappropriate indicators anyway. Perhaps Jason or others already dealt with this. The third sphere is equally important, which is fighting the struggles for equality and justice in a world which is highly unequal, whether it's with gender or it's with caste or it's with class or other things. And so this has to be also very much part of it. And this is important because you could well otherwise argue like a right-wing party in Europe saying we don't want refugees because we believe in localized politics and localized economic democracy, right? And so therefore we control everything and we don't want any refugees from Syria or whatever it is. And so you have to also look beyond that and look at the politics of equality and what does it mean to be able to live in a world which is also inclusive, even as you assert localization. And this then brings us to the fourth sphere, which is that of asserting and respecting the diversity of knowledge and culture. Now here in India, for instance, we have 780 living languages, full languages, not dialects, full languages. But unfortunately, when teaching happens in schools, it happens in mostly about 20, 22 languages, which are the ones that are recognized by the state. And so we're actually wiping out entire mother tongues, which are also libraries of knowledge. and because of which also local kids often get disprivileged because they can't manage with the state language, and nor are they left with their own mother tongue. So how does one actually sustain this kind of diversity, revive it where it's lost, and decolonize the different forms of knowledge systems also? If you remember the map that we showed you right at the beginning of the examples from different parts of the world, which had Africa on top and Europe below, people often ask us, well, why is this map upside down? And you again sort of get into this conversation of the fact that most of the maps we think are right side up are actually from colonial times, where Europe was on top and it was made to look much bigger than it actually is. And so there's many different ways by which we also have to decolonize our minds and our knowledge systems and technologies and media and so on. And the last part of this is that of rebuilding our relationship with the rest of nature. So the figure on the bottom left-hand side is the one I think Shrishtee and I probably grew up with in our biology classes, where human beings were right on top of some sort of an ecological pyramid. Note that there's a man on top and a woman is below. And whereas the one that we actually were never taught, but which is so much more meaningful today, is on the right-hand side, which is where human beings are just one out of hundreds, thousands, millions of species, right? And so therefore, knowing that we're part of nature, how do we respect the rest of nature and think of not just the rights of humans, but also the rights of the rest of nature? And so we get from here to this worldview or philosophy or ideology or conception of eco-swaraj. Let me explain Swaraj first. The term Swaraj means self-rule. Okay, Swa is self and Raj is rule. And so, but it's not just about my freedom regardless of anything else, which is, let's say, the American concept of freedom. It's really saying, yes, I will assert my autonomy. I will do what I want, but only insofar as it does not affect your autonomy and your happiness and your well-being. Okay. And so in effect, it actually is rights and responsibilities. And to do that, one has to look at oneself, one's own lifestyle, one's inner being as we look at the outside. And therefore the personal then, including lifestyles, also become the political. Now, what we've done here is to kind of extend that a little bit and say, when we talk about responsibility towards others, it should be also other species. And so therefore, eco-swaraj. In a way, the concept of Swaraj that Gandhi popularized during the independence movement kind of already tended towards that. But just to make it explicit, we've said Eco-swaraj. And the idea is very simple. Like the Sapara indigenous nation or the Mendhalekha village or many of the others saying, wherever we are the decision makers. But that we will also be responsible to other human beings and to the rest of nature when we take those decisions. And so the core of decision making becomes the community, defined in many different ways, not the government nor the corporation. It's a third element completely, which then becomes the core of decision making in this conception. As you all know, there are many other similar notions in different parts of the world. Old indigenous notions from across the global south, such as many forms of buen vivir, etc. in South America, Ubuntu and its variants in Africa, lots of things in native Northern America, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. But then also notions coming out from within the industrial world, such as degrowth, of course, which you're all dealing with, ecofeminism. I'm glad Ariel is speaking about that tomorrow, and many others. And I just wanted to put this side note here that one of the things that's happening in the last 2-3 years, and I have been telling, frankly, all my degrowth friends about this, is that there is a tendency, without really meaning to, make degrowth this overarching term and say, oh, degrowth and its variants in different parts of the world or something like that. It's just one out of many different notions, right? And so therefore, I think one has to be very careful not to have yet another form of colonialism, and in a good way, with good intentions, coming in when we talk about this pluriverse of alternatives. And at the core of this flower of transformation is perhaps our most important slide, because we have this very different notions and worldviews of alternatives. What binds them together? What binds all of us together? And for us, looking at all these different examples from around the world and these different worldviews and things coming up, what we think is binding us together is an expanding set of ethics, right? And many of us might think of these ethics as in different ways, interpreted in different ways, but there's something very common to this. There's a thread of commonality. And I'm just going to put this up here and pause for a second or so, because we don't have the time to go into each of these in detail. But essentially, these principles, these values, these ethics are very different from what the currently dominant system is telling us, right? So for instance, we have kept emphasizing on cooperation, commons, collectivity, rather than on individual competition, on privatization, etc. We have been talking about the rights of not just human beings, but also the rights of the rest of nature. There's a growing movement of looking at how can we live lives that are simpler, not poor, not deprived, but just simpler, because that's the only way to be able to have lifestyles that are sensitive to the earth, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to leave this up for a few seconds, and then we end in the next 5 minutes. And we can come back to the slide in the discussion if somebody wants to comment on it or raise questions. And so it's interesting, actually, in India, one of the things that's also coming to us is people are asking this question, okay, what do you think of the Green New Deal? Because it's becoming another buzzword, right? The Green New Deal in UK and USA and Europe. And what we're trying to say is that, well, okay, it's nice. I mean, in the sense, it's certainly much better than the conventional economic or conventional way of designing society, but it has several fundamental flaws to it, including continuing inequality between the global south and the north. So for instance, if you look at the Green New Deal that Bernie Sanders put forward as part of the election campaign in the USA, fantastic document in many different ways, but it had things like, okay, we'll switch from fossil fuels to electric cars. So every American will have an electric car and not a petrol or diesel based car. Now, as we know, if that is to happen, there has to be mining somewhere on the planet for the lithium and everything else that is required for the electric cars. So it's going to still continue a kind of an inequality of different kinds, and of course, continued ecological destruction, unless we go much more fundamental and ask ourselves, what is the lifestyle we want to lead? How do we become much more responsible to everybody on the planet? And so therefore, we're saying we need rainbow New Deals. We need revolutions of multiple colors, which have equality, which have justice, which have sustainability, which have all of these things built in, and not look at everything just from a climate perspective or just a greening perspective. Lots of questions for us to discuss and debate collectively, because obviously we don't have the answers to all of these things. From all these multiple different kinds of examples, how does macro change happen? And I'll come back to that in a minute. Who will sort of lead? And for me, I think what's been very inspiring is youth movements in different parts of the world, especially in the last decade or two, that have taken the lead on many, many aspects and I think, probably have much more imagination than some of us did in the past. What form of state do we need? Do we need a state at all? Or do we move towards a stateless society? If there is a state, or it's there right now, in what form and role should it be? What would global governance look like? The United Nations has been really useful in many respects, but it has also failed in many respects. So how do we create global governance that also respects all the aspects that we're talking about? What would a business sector look like? Completely controlled by workers and communities? Would there be any private business? And then, since many of us are part of academic institutions, how do academics themselves fundamentally transform to become much more responsive to and responsible to these sorts of transformations? So these are all questions I think that we can be part of discussing. And that first question about macro change, nobody has all the answers. It's a very difficult one. But I think to us, what we would like to see more and more is movements of resistance and alternative construction coming together. Sometimes they're the same, but very often they're not. For instance, you have a movement to, let's say, build a new constitution or take over the government, fine. But if one doesn't have some kind of prefigurative politics of where we want to then transform and how we want to transform the economy or the society, then we might slip back into the same, more or less the same kind of macroeconomic structures that the government we brought down had, which has happened in many parts of the world, right, with the left, with the established left parties. How do we bring, even as we ask for fundamental transformations, what are the pathways of transition towards those? Because obviously revolution is not going to happen overnight. So what forms of transition enable revolution? What forms of transition actually only strengthen the current status quo? How do we do visioning for the future and then build pathways towards that? These are all parts of what we hope will be critical masses that then will try and achieve macro change. And in order to do that, and that's the last few slides we have, we've set up these two processes, which Shrishtee will now describe and end the presentation.
Thanks, Ashish. So one process that Philippe had already mentioned about, but just to briefly expand on that, is the Sangam process, alternative confluences to translate roughly in English. The idea of this process was that while many of these local grounded process of alternatives are there, there's not enough space to actually talk about them, bring them to the forefront for people to know about them. And hence, we need a space where all of us can come together, know about these processes, actually collaborate, learn from each other, critically challenge each other, and how can we collectively, cross-sectorally, imagine alternative futures that we really want to build or work towards. And hence this process aims to do that by documenting many of these processes, but also creating these very many of these confluences, physical confluences, where people come together and actually share about their processes. So which have been regional in India, based on various regions in the country, and also thematic, like on well-being, on health, on democracy, on economy, and several others. A very inspired from, this is the website where many of these processes from India are documented, of alternatives, some of which we shared with you all in today's presentation. Next slide, please. And the other process which we all are part of is the global tapestry of alternatives. So inspired from the processes of Sangam here in India, but also in other parts of the world, which is in Mexico and in Colombia, called the Crianza Mutua process, doing a very similar exercise of actually bringing alternative initiatives and processes together. And after several conversations with various alternative movements across the world, it was felt that we need a process which actually brings together many networks of alternatives at a common platform at a global level, because there hasn't been, World Social Forum did attempt that, but there hasn't been a very constructive or a very proactive approach towards doing that. And so the idea is to build a confluence of resistance and alternatives across the world, creating a sharing, exchange, and collaborative space to do so. And a very common one, which is the collective envisioning for a just world, or many worlds that we want to live in. There's a website called the Radical Ecological Democracy, which has been documenting many of these global processes across the world. So you can take a look at it and get inspired. And this is the book that Ashish, you can speak about.
Okay, just quickly. So the book on the right-hand side, which is now available in English, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. Hopefully there'll be another 3-4 languages soon, is the one we've been mentioning, of 110 essays, 90 essays on radical alternatives from different parts of the world. So if you haven't already seen it, please do take a look. I'll put a link in the chat where you can download it, download the PDF. The one on the left-hand side is an interesting experiment we did a few years back of asking 40 people in different parts of the world, of the country, what is their dream vision of India in the future, say in 2100, completely dream, like totally idealistic vision of sexuality, gender, health, education, conservation, indigenous peoples, pastoralism, agriculture and food, etc. And then come back to the present and say, what are the pathways of getting to that kind of an ideal vision? So that's the book on the left-hand side, 35 essays of that kind. And we're going to end with this wonderful quote that Galeano, the Latin American poet, quoting the Argentinian film director Fernando Birri has, which is basically how what is the use of utopia? Because it constantly moves away as we try and move towards it. But as he says at the end, that exactly is the point. At least we are moving, we're walking, we're continuously advancing towards some kind of a vision of the ideal that we have. So with that, that's our emails. We'll put them also in the chat message for anybody who wants to continue after we finish this session. Thank you very much. Hopefully it's taken about 5 minutes extra.
Oh, that's just perfect. Thank you so much for this very impressive kind of tour de force through all those radical alternatives and alternative movements, for explaining the concepts of Eco-swaraj and all to us. It's been really great. Before we turn to the open discussion, as I said, I'm delighted to introduce you now to Christine Löw, who will first give a comment on the talk, and you'll have the opportunity to react to that comment, and then we'll have the open discussion. Christine Löw is a researcher at the Georg August University in Göttingen in Germany, and previously she held guest professorships in Tübingen and in Rhein-Waal in Kleve. She obtained her PhD from Frankfurt University with a thesis on Gayatri Spivak's post-colonial and feminist critique. Christine's thesis was published in 2007. Christine's research generally focuses on the intersections of gender studies, feminist and post-colonial theory, global political economy, social movements, environmental sociology, and the socio-ecological transformation. She has edited books on post-materialism, namely the Material Turn and Feminist Perspectives on Materiality and Materialism in 2017, a feminist critique of human rights in 2016, and also a special issue in the journal Femina Politica on Black feminisms. I can only highlight very few of the numerous papers and articles that she published. For example, just last year, I guess, Gender and Indigenous Concepts of Climate Protection, a critical revision of the REDD plus projects, or Politics on Land, Ownership and Gender Relations in Post-Colonial India. Christine, without further ado, I'd like you to take the opportunity to comment on the rich talk that Ashish and Shrishtee just gave us. Thank you.
So good morning, everybody. Can I be heard? Okay, perfect. Because often technology is not working from Frankfurt. Okay, first of all, thanks for the invitation to the theme week on degrowth. And then it is a great honor and pleasure for me to comment on Ashish and Shrishtee's work. And please forgive my heavy German English pronunciation. I hope I will be understood anyway. Okay, so thank you again for the, I found it also very rich and insightful presentation. I found it a pleasure to listen to it and also see the presentation slides. With this in mind, I will ask 3 questions in a really tone of solidarity. So my first question is on grassroots movements and states or the state. So I was really impressed how many different movements and struggles around the world you mentioned in the presentation. And I read them as concrete examples of the pluriverse. So with alternative concepts, worldviews, and practices. However, I was wondering if movements alone will be enough to bring about radical ecological and democratic change. Thus, I would argue that we need the state as a minimal structure of social redistribution. And at the same time, I think the transformation you both want to see is not about taking state power like elder leftist visions. So how would you think of the complex relations between nation states? I think there are also differences between global north and south, a state-centric global order and your ideas? That would be my first question. The second one is about the relationship between radical ecological democracy and gender relations, patriarchy and feminism. I would, of course, agree with your presentation that it is often rural women. You mentioned Dalit, marginalized farmers, landless peasants, pastoralists who mobilize for ecological aims. And in South America, many decolonial, communal, and/or popular feminists have stressed that care work from indigenous women transgresses many Western notions of reproductive labor, liberal notions often that include caring for the earth, for water, or communal self-organization of production, living, knowing, and existing. So how would you both situate the importance and relevance of indigenous women's struggles about territories, forests, and for new visions of alternative life in India? Because I was wondering a little bit if these emancipatory political activities are sometimes invisibilized from mainstream feminist approaches, but also from farmers, Dalits, or Adivasi movements. And my third question, the last one, is how about conceptualizing transnational solidarity. It's about knowledge production and differences between global South and North, because from my perspective, many grassroots movements in the global South have more expertise and a more thorough understanding about the intersections between economics, politics, and ecology, because I think the neoliberal globalization with finance capitalism is much more violently visible in the global South than in the global North. So you mentioned plural and diverse expertise, and I was really wondering if most people in Western countries will be able or willing to understand the need for radical ecological alternatives. Thus, I would argue it is necessary to listen in particularly to subaltern women organized in, for example, a network such as Food Sovereignty Alliance in India, in Andhra Pradesh or Telangana. But at the same time, we are confronted with powerful academic structures and institutions that support sanctioned ignorance, to call it with Gayatri Spivak. And you mentioned it as well. Currently in Europe, we can witness a massive marketing of a Green New Deal and the idea of climate neutrality in the mainstream media, but also in academia. And I find it unbelievably difficult to counter these myths of a green, sustainable economy or false solutions like red for climate change. So how would you, or how can we as activist scholars situated in the West be of any help to support your efforts for a pluriverse and for radical ecological democracy? And how would you conceptualize transnational solidarity so that we could learn from you and your perspectives and epistemologies? Thanks. These are my questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine, for those excellent questions. And Ashish and Shrishtee, you'll have the opportunity to react to those three questions in a second. I would just like to remind all of the others that you will be able to raise your own questions just after Ashish and Shrishtee will give their response, because we will open the webinar to all of you. But first of all, of course, Shrishtee and Ashish, please go ahead.
Shrishtee, you want to have a first go and then I'll add.
No, you go ahead and I'll add.
Okay. All right, Christine, thank you for this. I think, I mean, as I'm sure we all recognize, these are very complex issues and questions. So anything we say in the space of a few minutes is going to be unsatisfactory, not just because of shortage of time, but also because we don't have all the answers. I think we have to collectively look for them. I'll try and respond to each of these very briefly, and then I'm sure Shrishtee will add. So with regard to whether grassroots movements of the kind that we've talked about, are they enough, or do we also need the state as some sort of a structure for, say, redistribution? My inclination on this is to say that in the short run, because of the kind of serious structural issues that we are facing right now, especially, for instance, the increasing dominance of the private corporation, the state is a necessary, at the moment, a necessary institution to try and bring back some sense of redistribution, some sense of regulating corporations and so on. But in that sense, possibly right now, it's a bit of a necessary evil, right? But if you look at the kind of transformations that have taken place on a reasonably large scale in, say, the Zapatista movement and in the Kurdish Rojava movement, we talked about the Kurdish Rojava, not the Zapatista, or at a smaller scale in many other parts of the world, including indigenous peoples or sort of localized communities, they are achieving and trying to achieve redistribution of various kinds and dealing with inequalities of various kinds, not just wealth, but also gender, caste, etc., by means which have nothing to do with the state, right? They're able to do that because they're actually asserting this flower of transformation in different ways in each of the communes or villages or whatever, and then at that larger scale through the federation of these communes. And in that sense, if we look at that, then we can think of, in the long run, a world in which, in fact, without the state having to be there, this kind of structures could be built which achieve this redistribution. And in fact, if you look at it right now, most parts of the world, the state is actually only further reinforcing the maldistribution, right? The inequalities, etc. And certainly in India, that's what we're seeing right now. So it's not even being part of the solution. It doesn't even want to be part of the solution in so many parts of the world, right? So I think over a long term, anarchism in the best sense of the word is what at least I would try and tend towards. But in the short run, yes, we also have struggles for making the state accountable. We have struggles for making sure that, for instance, there are better environmental regulations on corporations and businesses, etc. So that struggle is also necessary right now. With the second question, I think this would be a really good one for Ariel tomorrow. If you're going to be there, you should ask her. She could certainly give, she's been giving me lectures on this when we were editing the pluriverse dictionary, because my understanding on this is poor. But I think in one sense, you're right that a lot of the sort of daily struggles of women, such as the Dalit women farmers struggle that we were talking about for food sovereignty, are not in the urban mainstream discourse of the feminist movement, or not really that much so, have not been in the past. But they're coming in much more now, because I think there's a much greater attempt at trying to create intersectionality even within the feminist movement, and then between the feminist movement and the ecological and the others. And because these struggles have become much more visible through the kind of work that not just we, but many people are doing, including in some parts of the media, it's not so easy to ignore them anymore. It's not so easy to invisibilize them anymore, except in some very sort of ivory tower academic circles where you can still, be deliberately ignorant. Or what's the word you used? I think sanctioned ignorance. It happens here also, not just in the West. So yeah, that would be my way of looking at it. But this is particularly why, through the Vikalp Sangam and other processes, we want to enable them to visualize themselves much more through participatory video, through their own stories, through bringing their voices out, through making sure there are platforms in which their voices can come out, so that it's not possible anymore to ignore them, and that people recognize that in fact that's the real feminist movement. Not real, sorry, that is the probably as important or more important a feminist movement than what's happening only in sort of rarefied academic circles. Well, that's a very partial answer to that question. Maybe Shrishtee has more wisdom on that. The third one on the Western public, it's actually not just the Western public, it's also the urbanized public in India and across the South, right? Or maybe people like me are also part of the global North in that sense. And the more heavily educated our population seems to be, the more it seems to actually be part of this sanctioned ignorance that you spoke about. Nice term. And so, how does one create a sensibility, a sensitivity, and awareness of these different modes of living, of the struggles on the ground, is an absolutely crucial part of the work we have to do. And this means a number of things. It means, for instance, trying to push for educational transformation and reform in which kids are learning about these movements. They're not just learning about what's happening in the so-called mainstream society, they're also learning about, through history, the kinds of ecological movements or social movements or justice movements that have taken place, where children are actually enabled to participate in them by taking them out into the field and going to places where these movements are happening. Some of the alternative learning institutions are doing exactly that. But also where, for instance, in our institutions of higher, so-called higher education, some of these movement people also become teachers. They may, actually, some of them may not even know how to read and write, but they can teach our students as good as well as any of us who have PhDs, right? You can take, if you're doing biology, taking them into a forest with an Adivasi elder who knows 200 species of plants is an incredible way of not just teaching kids and youth and people in higher education, but also giving that indigenous elder the status of a person of knowledge and wisdom, which is exactly the opposite of what, unfortunately, mainstream society is doing. We think of these people as being backward and primitive and, to be civilized kind of thing. So I think these are some of the sorts of things that that we're going to have to do. We know that as people in cities actually become more and more worried about things like chemicals in our body, health is something that touches everybody, right? Or now with climate, because the narrative is becoming so strong, nobody can ignore it really. At least people know there is something happening. That because there is that one seed of doubt in people's minds, there is perhaps a greater opening or the possibility of opening that into listening to other narratives. And I think we need to be able to use that. Just to give you a small anecdote, and then I'll stop. Most of my family is into business, including diamonds and all of that. I got left out, I don't know how. But so they're in Bombay, right? Now, somewhere or the other, they've heard somebody saying that Bombay is likely to be half under sea with climate crisis, with the climate change. So they've been asking me, saying, is this really true? Is, you work on environment, they know vaguely that I work on something to do with environment. Is this true that Bombay is going to be half underwater? And I say, yes. In another 30, 40 years, a lot of Bombay, and many of you who've got these plush houses right next to the sea, are going to have to shift elsewhere. That gets them worried. And then you start talking about some of the other issues that are related to this and some of the fundamental structure and all. Beyond the point, they're going to get bored and probably go to sleep. But, somewhere those seeds of doubt do get sowed. And then you start putting in saying, hey, listen, but it doesn't have to be like this. Here's another way in which everybody can be happy and prosperous in the right sense of the word, without causing this kind of damage. So we'll just have to find those avenues by which we can kind of enter into people's minds. And the last thing is, sorry, I said last thing last time, really last thing, is that when people get empowered to say no, that is to say, the resources that I, sitting in a city, I'm able to take from rural areas, whether it's minerals or water or whatever it is, and the garbage that I'm able to dump back into their areas, if those people get more and more empowered, as people are making themselves, are mobilizing themselves to say no, the more I'm going to actually sit up and say, hey, listen, where is my water? How come I don't have water today? Or why is it that garbage is not being picked up from my street? And that maybe also creates that kind of consciousness of something somewhere is really terribly wrong with the way I or my class of people are living and thinking. Sorry, that was a bit too long. Shrishtee, you want to?
Yeah, sure. So I will just go with the flow of the thought and possibly answer the third question first on transnational solidarity. And I would just add to what Ashish was saying was that one is that it is important to do, I think a lot of work at the moment is needed in myth busting, because within the civil society as well, because a lot of these things that are coming around on carbon credits and carbon neutrality and all of these things, they're creating a lot of confusion even in the movements and networks that we are working with. And so it is very important work that is to be done now by all of us. And I think that is where we need solidarity and working together. And the other part of that solidarity is also that wherever we are situated in Germany, we are situated in the US, we know many of these corporations, many of these governments, the so-called welfare governments are actually operating in oppressive ways in other parts of the world. So are we ready to question our own governments, our own corporations for the kind of inequality and unjust activities that they are perpetuating in other parts of the world? And that requires a lot of courage, and that requires a lot of work and solidarity. And that's where we need support from the global north, and also in global south, of questioning these corporations and these governments. And I think much more conversations around those things is something that we need to work towards in the coming few years. The other question that Christine, you asked about the red and the feminism, I think my own engagement with the community in Central India has been extremely inspiring, of the way the women, the indigenous women, have raised the questions of their lives in extremely patriarchal societies. And how they have been transforming, that has itself been quite illuminating for me in that way. And when we were having those conversations with them of how did you started a process of collectivizing of women, their first of how they narrated their stories was how when all of them were talking, all the men were talking about the issues of justice and how state has been oppressive to them, the women raised this concern that you cannot talk about justice only in one sphere and try to change the state while your own internal systems are very unjust, while you don't listen to our own voices, you don't listen to other castes. And they were able to raise issues not just about injustice within women, but also of injustice to the other caste. And I think that is what women are able to bring in, or that is what the feminine power is able to bring in, which is we are able to bring in the injustice, not just that is happening to us, but also to so much around us. And that's where the injustice to the rest of nature as well. And women, that's why, are always at the forefront of the resistance movements and at the forefront of all these challenges. And what they have done in that small region has been extremely powerful, because men have not just accepted women as leaders, but they have also changed their ways of functioning to be able to accommodate them in much better way, which we don't see happening. Of course, it's a start. There are lots of things to move or work towards, but it's a fantastic start of what has happened, which is, so just one example is that how women said that you do meetings whenever it is convenient for men to gather, but let's do meetings somewhere else. And that's where I think that has changed. One thing that is always a struggle is with our own notions on feminism. Like me, an activist living in an urban city, has my own sense of what feminism is, and what a woman living in central India in remote villages has a sense of feminism. That is always a struggle, and sometimes one has to accept that it is not going to be the same. For them, the struggle against liquor and domestic violence is an important struggle, while for me that might be an individual's freedom living in a city. But there's a convergence of certain basic principles that we were highlighting, and that needs to be strengthened more or spoken about. And just briefly on the first question, I wouldn't say that I have any conception. I'm still looking for that answer of what form of state we want, and what would be the nature of it. But again, with the examples that I have been engaged with, I think the notion of state is, or the way the state is visible in people's life is as a negotiating entity. So people are negotiating, speaking to the state, finding ways to work with it and also keep it away. So again, the example where I've been engaged with, state has played in some sense an important role there for some of the transformations that have happened, but it has also been quite a repressive force. And so people are trying to negotiate it in such a way that it stays away from their own systems, but also can be used to get certain rights and entitlements recognized. So I think that is so much more to learn again from, of how people are negotiating with the state, with not completely saying no to it, but also in many ways saying that you need not be present in some of our local movements, and how they actually keep it away. And there's lots of elements to it, but just to briefly reflect on that question. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much.